Monde Sauvage is the only classical safari park in Belgium. Spread across an impressive 88 hectares, it doesn't just offer a drive-through safari experience, but also a zoo section that can be explored on foot. And the fact that this includes large carnivores, great apes, and even polar bears already makes it clear that this park is quite something. That being said, let's be upfront, Monde Sauvage is by no means a particularly modern park. But does that automatically mean that the needs of some very demanding species are not being met? Should the park be avoided altogether, or is a visit still worthwhile in the end? That's exactly what we'll be looking at today in this zoo review. I'd also be very interested in your thoughts, especially if you've visited Monde Sauvage yourself, but of course also based on this video. Let me know your impressions in the comments, and have you even heard of Monde Sauvage before watching this video? Because I suspect that outside of Belgium many people may never have come across this park at all, except perhaps in the border regions of Germany and the Netherlands. Monde Sauvage is located near Liège, making it just an hour drive from Aachen or Maastricht. I myself originally come from this border region and had already visited the park as a child. When I returned together with my parents and first drove through the safari section, I could only remember it very vaguely, even though it must actually have been the very first safari park I ever visited. As you have probably already seen, the experience initially unfolds exactly as you'd expect from a safari park. You drive through the area either by car or alternatively on a small train. The landscape is quite expansive and is primarily home to African ungulates. For us, the first species we encountered were the impressive common elands, the largest antelope species in the world, followed by roan antelopes, which were equally striking. Zebras, of course, are an absolute must in any safari park, and it's hard to imagine such a park without giraffes as well. Interestingly, I later read on the park's website that giraffes only returned to the safari in March of 2024, after an absence of 15 years. In the giraffe area I also spotted sable antelopes. In addition, the park keeps Watusi cattle, red lechwe, a species not kept at all in Germany for example, as well as the beautiful scimitar-horned oryxes. While this first area is very open and largely consists of grassland, the second section you pass through about halfway is a much denser forest. Here, alongside more lechwe, you'll also find nyalas and bongos, which naturally fit in this woodland setting perfectly. And speaking of scenery, the landscape here is generally beautiful, especially with the views into the distance. Only in the far rear corner, where we encountered the giraffes, does the infrastructure feel a bit rustic. The stable buildings in particular stand out, as they may well represent the weak point of animal husbandry here. Because while there is little to criticize at first glance in such a spacious safari enclosure, it's obviously crucial to know what conditions are like in the heated indoor facilities during winter, and unfortunately I don't have that information. The same applies to the white rhinoceros, which can be seen in a separate enclosed area. This enclosure doesn't compare to the vast safari landscape, but in terms of space, structure and general layout it appears to be quite solid. And yes, in the past elephants were also kept here. Hippos, however, can still be seen here today, in a pool located right within the safari area. The pool is fenced off, and the available land area for the hippos seems rather limited. That being said, it appears they are regularly given access to the safari area around it, perhaps especially in the evenings after visitors have left. And in that case, this could actually represent a fairly good setup, given that hippos in the wild usually only leave the water after sunset to graze on land. Overall, I don't really have much to criticize about the safari section, but on the way to the parking lot, it slowly dawned on me that even as a child, I hadn't been particularly impressed by the zoo section. Already on the way you pass a large deer enclosure, and right next to the parking area live dromedaries, and there was even a calf which was really cute. From the parking lot, the path first leads past several parrot aviaries. One of them appears relatively modern and above all very well furnished, while the opposite ones look noticeably older. Species on display include grey parrots, citron-crested cockatoos and scarlet macaws, although the exact species mix likely changes over time. Their indoor enclosures are located at the rear inside a dome where parrot shows also take place. Unfortunately, we missed those. From what I have seen online, these presentations do not merely showcase flight skills, but also highlight the animal's intelligence. Under the dome there are also several other species, such as this armadillo, which curiously scurried through its enclosure. In addition, the building houses tortoises, several terrariums with reptiles and tarantulas, as well as great curassows and Javan rhinoceros hornbills, two truly fascinating bird species that are both not exactly everyday zoo animals. Unfortunately, however, they have no outdoor aviaries, and overall the building feels rather outdated, as if the best years are clearly behind it. This impression continues at the sea lion enclosure. Sure, I do not know what the animals are offered behind the scenes inside this hall, but the outdoor enclosure itself definitely does not meet modern husbandry standards. Here we did see the presentation, which, despite the lack of shaded areas, was very well attended. And being able to see the impressive bull up close was an impressive experience. Such a large and powerful animal that somehow still looks like an oversized, adorable dog. But yes, there is a reason why many zoos in Europe have recently revised or completely overhauled their seal and sea lion facilities, and I really wish Monde Sauvage would do the same. Polar bear husbandry, on the other hand, has been abandoned entirely by many zoos, but not here. From the sea lions, you reach the polar bear enclosure via the so-called Bear Canyon, which was described on the website as an awe-inspiring set. Well, that strikes me as somewhat exaggerated. And between artificial rock formations, you look down onto an enclosure that at first glance appears rather small and quite bleak. On closer inspection, however, it becomes clear that the old concrete structure has at least been upgraded with substrate, but more importantly, since 2018 there has been a second enclosure section, allowing the animals to be separated when needed and effectively doubling the available space and presenting a far more natural forest-like environment. That is still not enough for me to call this a good polar bear enclosure, but it does remain a solid example of what can be achieved as an expansion, even with relatively limited financial resources. On the other side of the Bear Canyon, you overlook the brown bear enclosure. Here too, there is a second enclosure area at the rear, and while there is certainly room for improvement in terms of furnishing, this results in a reasonably solid setup overall. During my visit, one of the brown bears was pacing back and forth in the same spot for quite some time, almost directly opposite this building, which likely plays a role, but later in the day the behavior had subsided and the bear was no longer pacing. The Humboldt penguin enclosure at the end of the Bear Canyon marks the first genuinely attractive enclosure in the zoo section, in my opinion. My only real criticism here is the lack of an underwater viewing area. That is of course completely irrelevant to the penguins themselves, but it also means I cannot really assess the depth of the pool. In terms of surface area, however, both the water and land section appear appropriately sized. From here the path continues into a forested area, where the large bison enclosure initially raises hope that things will now take a more positive turn again. And while the enclosure for the North American porcupines, even within an artificial tree trunk, can only be viewed through mesh, the husbandry conditions here are alright. Visitors' views are far less obstructed at the prairie dog enclosure, although I have to say I definitely have seen significantly larger prairie dog habitats elsewhere, or honestly almost everywhere. The forest area is also home to the adorable red pandas, as well as binturongs, which unfortunately were asleep during my visit. Both enclosures are well designed and above all well furnished for the animals. At most, the fencing could be seen as a drawback, but once again, that is something that mainly affects visitors, not the animals themselves. There is also a quite good looking wolf enclosure that naturally fits well into the forest setting, and the entire area can be overlooked from a viewing platform, which then leads us to the so-called Monkey Islands. Here, in a truly beautiful and natural setting, you can first observe lemurs, more specifically ring-tailed lemurs in this case. Opposite this lies the enclosure for fossas. Visually, it does not make a particularly strong impression at first glance, and it could certainly make more use of vertical space. However, in terms of size and furnishing, it's fundamentally solid. And honestly, I much prefer this to seeing animals in a high-gloss setting like Biopark Valencia, where a lot of money has been spent on visual spectacle and massive water modes to give visitors an unobstructed view, but in terms of making the most of the available resources for the animals' benefit, this is more convincing to me. And with that, we arrive at the rear side of the lemur island and at the island of the chimpanzees. Unfortunately, an enclosure that combines just about the worst of both worlds. Because, as you may know, I'm generally not a fan of water modes for great apes, not just because they are unusable space for the animals, they can also be a potential death trap. And on top of that, the building here has a very prison-like feel, and overall the island itself is not even great to look at. The enclosure is not tiny and there are at least some climbing structures in place, but in the end, aside from its size, it is simply mediocre in almost every respect. The Gibbon Islands look considerably better, at least from a visual standpoint, but when it comes to climbing, or rather swinging structures, there is definitely a lot of room for improvement. One positive note is that by now there should be a new indoor enclosure for them. The Orangutan Island fits into this rather mixed overall impression as well. The island concept means that the animals can only be observed from a distance, and despite the artificial rockwork and waterfall, the enclosure is not especially impressive visually. The furnishing with climbing frames and tensioned ropes are perfectly fine. The coolest aspect here is probably that the orangutans are socialized with wanderoos, which we didn't get to see, but that's okay, especially because, as you may have already noticed, the orangutans had a baby. As nice as that was, the ape islands as a whole leave a fairly uneven impression. Conceptually, the most interesting aspect here is actually how the keepers access the islands and indoor enclosures. And ultimately, the most appealing thing about the area is the surrounding landscape. The islands are nicely embedded into their natural setting, still, especially the two great ape enclosures themselves are visually rather underwhelming. The best enclosure in this area is probably the otter enclosure right next to the new Gibbon house. It impresses with its size, natural design, and even a view across to the bison enclosure behind it, so really convincing all across the board. Beyond the ape islands, we reach the very back corner of the zoo, where there is a large bird of prey center. As I did not want to keep my parents waiting for too long, I skipped the bird of prey show despite the really impressive scenery here. Almost all species can be admired in aviaries though, and fortunately most of these are quite decent. Visually, however, everything here once again feels more functional than polished. The collection includes numerous vultures, owls, and eagles, with condors probably being the most impressive species for most visitors. From here we begin to walk back, passing an enclosure for moose, where a relatively large forested area has simply been fenced in. And yes, the fence is visually rather underwhelming again, but it comes with the advantage that you can get very close to the animals, or perhaps more accurately, the animals can get very close to you. And when a massive moose walks right past you, that is genuinely impressive. Opposite this, on the other side of the stables we saw earlier, there is another giraffe enclosure separated from the safari area. In addition to the giraffes, ostriches live here as well. Normally you should be able to walk up to an elevated viewpoint that offers a really nice overview of the enclosure, but unfortunately this was closed during our visit. So we move on directly to the red kangaroos and emus, which once again live in a large and attractive enclosure. As a visitor, the only potential annoyance here is the fence again, although a little further along you can also look over it. And from here on the opposite side there is also another view of the rhinoceros enclosure. But even though we are now again near the brown bear enclosure, we are far from finished. As the site of the cheetahs already suggests, we are now entering the carnivore section. The cheetah enclosure is not huge, but it's well structured, including viewing platforms, and that already gives a good first impression of what to expect here. In addition to cheetahs, the park keeps lions, lynx and leopards. I remember that in the past even more species were held here, and as a result several enclosures have since been merged. This has led to a surprisingly good leopard enclosure. As you may know, I have long struggled to find a truly good leopard enclosure, and I did not expect to get this close to one here of all places. Don't get me wrong, it could still be significantly better, but if I saw this correctly, there are 3 enclosures between which the animals ideally rotate. All 3 could certainly be larger on their own, above all higher, but they are very well furnished. Because the enclosures have been deliberately allowed to become overgrown, the animals can hide well, have plenty of shade, and the visitor experience is also massively improved by this. While cages are not necessarily bad for animals per se, bear cages are never a pleasant sight. Overgrown like this, however, the entire area has a wild, almost romantic charm and even somewhat of a jungle atmosphere. And despite the dense vegetation, there are still repeated glass viewing panels, so with a bit of luck you can still get excellent views of the animals. The lynx enclosure benefited from this as well, although the lynx have since moved into a new enclosure, meaning this may now effectively be another additional leopard enclosure. If anything, the lions need an upgrade more urgently, because here I am less convinced. The structure and furnishing are the weakest in this section, and due to the heavy vegetation, the animals probably don't see much of their surroundings, which lions would absolutely love to. Still, I would ultimately argue that this may be the best old-school carnivore area I have seen so far. In other words, yes, if you build completely new enclosures from scratch, you could definitely do much better. But given what was already there, this is probably the maximum that could realistically be achieved. By the way, I earlier skipped one cat species that lives here and that we unfortunately did not see, which is a real shame because leopard cats are extremely rare in zoos. From the carnivore area, you can also take a detour to the South American Plateau, an enclosure complex that only opened in 2022. Its centerpiece is a large mixed species enclosure viewed from an elevated platform. Here live rheas, maras, South American tapirs, and a few other species. The enclosure is not only spacious, but also very well furnished, including 2 ponds. I have nothing to criticize here at all. The giant anteater enclosure next door is also very well done, while on the other side you can approach an aviary for hooded vultures, where one of the birds was clearly very interested in the visitors and especially my shoes. Even if it's not immediately obvious from this angle, the aviary is also quite spacious and well designed. Maned wolves are kept here as well, in an enclosure divided into several sections. The densely vegetated terrain can be viewed across a moat in one place and through glass panels elsewhere. From another point in the Carnivore complex, you can even enter a hut via a rather uninviting corridor, where you then suddenly feel as if you are standing right inside the maned wolf enclosure. Conceptually a very cool idea. Overall, it's noticeable that the South American area also did not have a massive budget, but both for the visitor experience and more importantly for the animals, a genuinely strong enclosure complex has been created here. Behind the carnivore area, the path leads in a walk-through aviary housing, among others, flamingos, ibises and storks, all while passing an adjacent aviary with additional flamingos and other waterfowl. From here you finally reach a farm animal area with a playground and restaurant, where children in particular can really let off steam in a very pleasant setting, including a large adventure ship. The area also includes markhor and white-naped cranes, as well as porcupines, whose enclosure is probably among the weakest in the entire park. I thought that was it, but somewhat off the side and not marked on the map, I also discovered Aldabra giant tortoises. Their enclosure clearly shows that it was only completed recently in 2022. So, what do we make of this park? While the safari part is good and offers little to criticize, the zoo section is clearly mixed. The picture that emerges is of a park that was family owned for over 40 years and after its opening in 1975 was never modernized enough to keep pace with contemporary standards, largely for financial reasons. At the same time, I do get the impression that pragmatic solutions have repeatedly been sought and found to improve animal welfare and increase the park's appeal. That has not stopped visitor numbers from steadily declining over the past 15 years. However, the most recent chapter in this story is that a new investor group took over the park in 2024 and immediately presented an extremely ambitious 5-year master plan. Even though many articles about this are unfortunately locked behind a paywall, everything I have been able to read and see suggests that this park could soon be completely transformed. We are talking about ideas such as a Jurassic Park-inspired glassware safari developed in cooperation with Formula E manufacturers. That is pretty wild. When you suddenly have an investor with ambitions like that, planning to put down 15 to 20 million euros over the next 5 years, it becomes clear that the image of this park could change entirely. And even though all of this is still in the future, I do think that a visit is already worthwhile today. Perhaps especially because much of the park's wild, romantic charm will likely disappear over time as changes are implemented. At the same time, it's reassuring to know that where animal husbandry currently falls a bit short, there is at least a good chance that it will change for the better. In other words, if Monde Sauvage has not been on your radar so far, now is the time to change that, especially if visitor numbers start to recover in the coming years. I see real potential here. Given the park's location, size and animal collection, this could become a really cool place. I'm genuinely curious to see what will happen here over the coming years and decades. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below, give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, take care, see you soon, or as we say in Germany, es ist zwar schon Februar, aber frohes neues Jahr.